This is a glass of water, colorless, tasteless. It contains 100 gamma of LSD-25, 1/10 of a milligram, the equivalent of 1/600th of a grain. An ounce of this material will make 150,000 such doses. Let us observe the effect some 3 hours later.
Well, tell me.
Well, I just couldn't. I couldn't possibly tell you. It's here. Can't you feel it? This whole room, this everything is in color, and I can feel the air. I can see it. I can see all the molecules. I'm part of it. Can't you see it?
I'm trying.
Oh, it's just like you're released, or you're free, or I don't know how I can tell you.
How do you feel inside?
Inside. I don't have any inside.
Is it all one?
It would be all one if you weren't here, and if nobody else. Yes, everything is one. You have nothing to do with it. I am one with what I am. I can see everything in color. Everything. You have to see the air. You can't believe it. And the dimensions and all the prisms and the rays and everything coming down through you and moving.
What does this all mean to you?
I've never seen such infinite beauty in my life. It's like a curtain or a spider web. Can you see it? It's right here in front of me, right now. Watch. No. Oh, good heavens. You know what went through me? It passed right through me.
Could you feel it?
Me? There isn't any me.
Welcome again to the Psychedelic Suitcase. I'm Dave McNee. In this episode, we talk with Shelby Hartman and Madison Margolin. They are the co-founders of the magazine DoubleBlind. Its focus is psychedelics, but it touches on way more than that. It's because of the stories they tell and the way that they tell them. DoubleBlind is quickly becoming one of the louder voices in the psychedelic community. Other than the magazine that they put out twice a year, you can also find them online, doubleblindmag.com. So how did it all start? How did they meet?
Madison and I both went to Columbia Journalism School at the same time. When did we graduate, Madison? 5 years ago? 4 years ago?
2015. Wow.
Time is a funny thing. And we heard a lot about each other because we were covering similar things and interested in similar things, but weirdly never met when we were at Columbia Journalism School because we were in different programs.
Right.
And then several years later, we were both cannabis columnists at LA Weekly, and I was working on a story, and I contacted her dad, who is kind of, I don't know if legendary is the right word, but that's how I perceive him, a legendary cannabis attorney, to interview him. And I didn't even know that he was her dad. And at the end of the interview, he said, by the way, you know, my daughter Madison, she's a journalist. She went to Columbia at the same time as you. She also writes for LA Weekly on cannabis. You guys should really meet. So at that point, I said, okay, the universe is really conspiring to put us together. And we got coffee and just after that started working together.
So what is the connection between this magazine they've now created and psychedelics? And what do they want people to get out of it?
Yeah, so it's using psychedelics as a jumping off point to talk about larger issues, including environmental justice, social equity, mental health, spirituality, queerness, you know, kind of all of the above. And so really what I would say it's more psychedelic magazine than it is a magazine about psychedelics. And what I mean by that is like psychedelics kind of open you up to like thinking of things in different ways and, you know, make you feel more connected to the world around you and people around you. And so like I would hope that our magazine can kind of embody that psychedelic ethos a little bit. And so as far as people getting something out of it, a physical magazine is something that is about mindfulness, right? Like you sit down and you read it and you put your phone down, and for however long you're reading it, you're kind of interacting with this tangible object. And then the ideas in DoubleBlind are meant to really foster an awareness about all these other topics that I mentioned. And oftentimes it's, you know, psychedelics can allow us to consider them in a different way.
There were a couple of articles that each of them had written that I had questions about. Shelby had written an article about the ayahuasca privilege, and how for a lot of people, traveling down to Peru to get this much-needed medicine is cost prohibitive. I was wondering if the same problem was just around the corner for psilocybin and MDMA once they become approved for therapy.
Absolutely, it is a problem. And I would say that of the two topics or overarching themes that Madison and I are most devoted to talking about at DoubleBlind, the first is healing and the second is equity. Because when you look at alternative healing modalities, not just psychedelics, but meditation retreats, or now there's this whole burgeoning industry of life and wellness coaches, a lot of whom are reaching audiences on Instagram. There's Reiki, there's acupuncture. I mean, there's an infinite number of alternative healing modalities which are showing a lot of promise for conditions that the Western medical community, quote unquote, has not been able to figure out, but they're not covered by insurance, which makes them prohibitively expensive. Not to mention the fact that if you are not a part of a sort of wellness community already, you may not have even heard of these things. And this is definitely a really big topic of conversation within the psychedelic community, both in regards to underground psychedelic treatments, psilocybin ceremonies, ayahuasca ceremonies, 5-MeO-DMT, whatever else, as well as the psychedelic medicine framework that is being put forth to be approved by the FDA, whether that's psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy or MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Ketamine is not covered by insurance companies right now because it's showing a lot of promise for a treatment-resistant depression, but it's being prescribed as quote-unquote off-label. Right. So that's a really big problem, right? Is that if a medication is approved by the FDA for a condition that you are not using it for, then it's not going to be covered by insurance. So we're not really sure at this point, for example, if MDMA is going to qualify for insurance coverage if it's being prescribed as an off-label treatment. It's being researched right now. Phase 3 is the final phase in FDA-approved studies for post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's also shown incredible promise for a variety of conditions, from couples therapy, which I don't think is ever going to be considered an indication, to addiction. I mean, not to mention the fact that if you aren't actually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a very particular kind of trauma which presents as flashbacks and an unhealthy sort of operation of the fear or flight response in the brain, right, you could still have trauma manifesting in a lot of different kinds of ways. So it's super complicated and it's a big problem.
There's of course another side to this. Not everybody that takes psychedelics has a problem that they're trying to fix. Some people may be looking for a spiritual experience, or just a way to connect with something inside of them or the world around them.
Absolutely. I mean, Bob Jesse, who's kind of an iconic behind-the-scenes psychedelic advocate who played a role in some of the earliest Johns Hopkins trials for the psychedelic renaissance, has coined this phrase, the betterment of well people. Right. Everything I just referred to, with all the limitations around sick people accessing psychedelics, obviously that doesn't even get into the conversation around what about all the well people and what about all the people who legitimately want to access these experiences for spiritual and religious reasons.
And going back for a second to the article about ayahuasca, I wondered their thoughts about the sustainability of ayahuasca. Are the resources being depleted by tourists?
It's a very, very complicated topic because in terms of the sustainability of the ayahuasca vine itself, it's not definitive that the ayahuasca vine is threatened and that this is because of the influx of tourists to the Amazon. Right. There's actually, there's a well-known, what does he call himself? He's not an anthropologist. I forget what his title would officially, his academic, Chris Killam. Okay. And he went down to the Amazon and did a big report study that he published within the last few years, investigating the sustainability of the ayahuasca vine in the wake of concern. And he interviewed, dozens of people, indigenous communities, went to the ayahuasca farms himself, trekked through the rainforest to find wild ayahuasca vine, and came to the conclusion that the ayahuasca vine is just fine. Right. Yeah. So, that's we want to do, we actually have on the horizon a investigative story that is using his report, but also interviewing a variety of other stakeholders in the area to see, the extent to which that's true. But I think that it's important for us to be cautious about the types of things that we're saying. The tourism industry, whether, quote unquote, Westerners should be drinking ayahuasca at all, and, the cultural appropriation of indigenous traditions. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation, and the sustainability of the vine is just one small part of that. So whether or not the vine is at risk, maybe, doesn't change whether, the conversation around what it means to have reverence for indigenous wisdom and what it means to give back to indigenous communities who have long preserved plant medicine. Definitely. On DoubleBlind, we just built what we're calling like the Sacred Reciprocity Fund. And so now when you check out of our website, of our store, you have the option to donate to a vetted nonprofit or grassroots organization that supports indigenous knowledge and wisdom. And I'll just say on the podcast that in the early part of this year, what we're planning to do is create a Sacred Reciprocity database, which includes a variety of nonprofits. And we're asking any that support indigenous plant wisdom. And we're asking anyone who has a website to publish this database so that people know how they can donate to groups. And I mean, it's an important time to be having this conversation, especially as, ayahuasca and ibogaine and other traditional plant medicines enter kind of like the clinical trial context, because there are a lot of indigenous communities who feel that is extremely sacrilegious. And I'm not going to take a stance and say that stance one way or the other. I understand that if someone has treatment-resistant depression and ayahuasca might be able to help them, or they're addicted to opioids and ibogaine might be able to help them, that there's incredible value in that. I also understand why, indigenous communities would feel that this is just like one more exemplification of how we have continually extracted them for everything.
On December 22nd, 2019, spiritual leader Ram Dass passed away. If you're not familiar with Ram Dass, he was an American who traveled to India in the 60s, met the Maharaji, and brought back a lot of the teachings. He's best known for the inspirational book, Be Here Now. And this brings me to the second article I wanted to talk to them about. Madison was lucky enough to meet Ram Dass, so I had to ask her about that. But first, here's a short clip of Ram Dass.
It takes us a long time, many of us longer than others, to come up out of the darkness of our feelings of unworthiness, of unlovableness, of allowing that liquidity to happen, of feeling safe to be in the presence of love. When I first experienced my guru loving me, my mind kept flickering with the thoughts of, if he only knew. And then I realized that he did know. And he was still loving me. And it took me through the and whatever you are, however you are at this moment, when you can accept that you are lovable, then the fear starts to dissolve. It's allowing your own beauty. It's allowing the beauty of your soul, which is behind your personality. It's behind all that stuff. Just another radiant bit of light, another soul.
I've known Ram Dass basically my whole life. I can't say I had a super close relationship to him, but he was always very present. He's the one who introduced my dad to Maharaji, who was the guru of Ram Dass's guru and my father's guru and the guru of their entire satsanga community. So he was always very present in my life. He married my father and my stepmother, ex stepmother now. But yeah, when I was 16, I really always resisted the whole hippie thing that my parents were into, mainly because, as a kid, it was weird and my parents were different and so I didn't appreciate it as a kid. But at 16, my mom took my brother and I to Hawaii and, of course we visited Ram Dass and she and I were fighting. We always kind of argue. And I had flipped her off by scratching my cheek with my middle finger. Like I thought I was really sly. And of course, we get to Ram Dass's house, and she loves to just like dump her problems on him. And of course, we're talking about someone who is trained in psychotherapy from Harvard, so he does know how to deal with this kind of stuff. And he listened to us, and he didn't make a big deal out of fact that I had acted out. And when we left, or when we were leaving Ram Dass's house, he was kind of making fun of both me and my mom, and he waved goodbye to me, and in the same gesture he like scratched his cheek with his middle finger. And I just think it's funny because everyone's Ram Dass stories are like these big spiritual like moments of whatever, and my story, the one that I remember the most clearly, is how Ram Dass flipped me off.
Exactly. One of the things I liked about the article that you wrote about Ram Dass was it not only a tribute to the man, but also a call to action.
Okay, so I actually got into a little bit of a tiff with a baby boomer on Facebook about a week ago. And what happened was I wrote this article and everyone responded really well to it. And one of the people in the community posted the article in a Facebook group. And I had said in the article that at the time when Ram Dass wrote Be Here Now, that we were in potentially less turmoil then, or the world was maybe less chaotic or less turmoil than it is today. And someone called me out and said, well, you're not acknowledging Vietnam and, the start of the drug war and, all these things that were happening at that time, which I completely acknowledge. And I did say potentially less turmoil, so to leave room for that accuracy. But what I'm saying is that was a different time, and by and large, the baby boomers who got to know Ram Dass intimately, the baby boomers have had it a little bit easier, I think, than the current generation. And we're coming of age and growing up into something that is just way more chaotic and unpredictable, and the planet is dying, and Trump is president, and there are all these things that are happening. And I it's hard not to wonder, like, okay, we'll be here now. It's easy to be here now when you're in a comfortable position,
Right.
and you have the luxury of meditating and doing yoga and spending money on spiritual retreats and whatever. And so it really hit home when I was at a screening of Becoming Nobody, which is one of the most recent Ram Dass documentaries. It was at the Google Empathy Lab in Venice, California, and it's an area that's super posh, but also Google's campus is surrounded on all sides by homeless encampments.
Right.
And I was like, okay, like it was just this stark contrast of affluence and then this homelessness that's taking over Los Angeles. And I was wondering, what my call to action is, yes, be here now, but is this a here and now that we all want to be in?
Right.
And if it's not, like, how can we, how can the impetus to be here now also motivate us to improve the here and now?
Exactly.
And I do think that, like, there's this idea in Judaism called tikkun olam, which is like repair the world. And, I think part of being here and now is making the here and now as equitable and good as possible. And just to kind of, the last part of the point I want to make is that Maharaji, who's the guru, his whole thing was feed everyone. Like, if you want to serve God, just feed people. Like, it's the most basic thing you could do. And so really, like, service toward other people, I think, is like the heart of what Be Here Now is.
Living in the moment isn't easy always, and it's too easy to be comfortable and take things for granted.
Someone did ask in the Q&A, and it was a really interesting moment, because I don't think everyone had considered it. It's really easy to kind of ignore the problem that's right under your nose, literally.
Definitely.
And I think being here and now is taking it all in. And when you see a problem, then what do you do about it?
So the second issue of DoubleBlind is out now. The third is coming in June. I was wondering what stories they were working on.
Well, we're coming out with our third issue, of course, in the second half or around June.
Yeah.
But we have a whole editorial lineup. We have, tomorrow, we also, in addition to our print magazine, we're publishing content online. So Monday next week, you'll be reading something about mushroom dispensaries. And we're really aiming to follow sort of the psilocybin movement and industry as there are all these decriminalization measures, and also people, trying to look at, I see psilocybin really as following the trajectory of cannabis a little bit. And so how can we both see what to avoid and what to do based on our experience with legal marijuana?
So where does it stand now? It's Denver, right? And Oakland, is that right?
Denver decriminalized psilocybin. Oakland decriminalized all plants and theogenic plants. And and there are also initiatives in Chicago, New York, Dallas, like dozens of cities around the country that are through this group called Decriminalize Nature to do the same. And there's also a statewide initiative in California to decriminalize psilocybin.
So how do they see the decriminalization of magic mushrooms rolling out?
So, I mean, let's say that California votes to decriminalize psilocybin this year in 2020. Then we'll have to deal with the retail component. A lot of activists are hoping that psilocybin mushrooms will be, quote, abrogated into existing industries, meaning that, the same way you buy reishi tinctures or powders or, like health food supplements, like psilocybin could just fit already into that particular, into that niche of the industry already. Like this doesn't need to be treated, a quote unquote mistake that a lot of people say was made with cannabis was that they were treating that agricultural product is different from any other agricultural product that you consume, and it really didn't have to be
Right. Yeah.
that different.
Compared to cannabis and how the laws have changed for that, how does that compare to magic mushrooms?
There are a lot of differences. I would say the first one is that psychedelic research is actually far ahead of cannabis research. And part of that is because of this crazy monopoly that NIDA has had on cannabis for research for decades at the University of Mississippi that has made it nearly impossible for researchers at the federal level to even access cannabis. So psilocybin is on the fast track to being approved as a medication, both for treatment-resistant depression as well as, I think it's called like general depression disorder. Is that what it's called? GDD. Anyway, when it is legalized, it is legalized as a therapy tool, right? So like, and all psychedelics are inherently distinct from cannabis in that it's always going to be legalized within this medically within an entire framework and infrastructure that includes like therapy and preparing for the experience and then having the experience and then processing the experience. Additionally, we know that the way psychedelics work is that in comparison to cannabis is that cannabis is something that you have to continue to use and that it treats acute symptoms. So in the case of PTSD, you have to, let's say you're using it as a veteran for insomnia, you have to take it every single night for your insomnia. Whereas with psychedelics, you might have a psilocybin experience or an MDMA experience 2 or 3 times and essentially be cured. So that really, really changes the model as well. Secondly, I would say, and we write about this in DoubleBlind second issue, which just came out, that there is a massive decriminalization movement, not because decriminalization is necessarily being seen as a path to medical and then recreational legalization the way that cannabis was. A lot of people see like, oh, first we're going to decriminalize and then we're going to legalize medically and then we're going to legalize recreationally. Instead, actually, decriminalization is seen sort of in opposition to a retail recreational dispensary market, because what it's doing, at least in like counties and cities where there's something written into the initiative that allows people to grow their own mushrooms, is it's kind of giving people the power back in as much as it's allowing them to grow mushrooms in their own homes without fear of prosecution, and empowering people to do that.
One of the things that was just mentioned was about integration and how important it is. A psychedelic trip may just be the first step into a very long journey. I wanted to get their thoughts on the importance of integration.
Integration is really very interesting, I think, because a lot of times we talk about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, and we don't talk about the fact that the psychedelic experience itself is just one part of the healing process. And that's actually kind of I don't want to say it's a dangerous misconception, but it is a really key misconception, because Madison talks about this a lot. She says, we don't judge how people choose to take their drugs at DoubleBlind. Like if someone wants to go take mushrooms in the forest with their friends, like they might have a life-changing experience. They might not. It might just be a lot of fun. Like that's great. That's legitimate. But what we do see from the research is that the integration, meaning the sessions that you have with a therapist after the psychedelic experience, in which you are actively recalling the sensations, the thoughts that came up for you, and thinking about how to make sense of them, how to apply them in a real way, that is just as important as the trip itself. And, I'll just, get a little personal and say that I recently started going to see a psychedelic integration therapist for the first time after having used psychedelics for the last decade. And I've just been amazed by how many nuggets of wisdom I've been able to pull from an ayahuasca experience that I had like 5 years ago. And the philosophy of this integration therapist is don't go back for more psychedelics until you have reaped all the wisdom you can from the experiences that you've already had.
You get this sense with this new sort of renaissance in psychedelics that they're about to sort of go mainstream.
I think if you include microdosing, then absolutely. I mean, just so many more people are being introduced to psychedelics through the idea of microdosing, which doesn't even require you to get quote unquote high.
Right.
And so, especially in jurisdictions where psilocybin is going to be or already is decriminalized, you have this opportunity to get to know the medicine without having to dive deep into a full-on trip. And I wish I had known that in my beginning stages of psychedelics. Is I thought the only way to experience psilocybin was on like an eighth of mushrooms.
Right.
I had no idea. It never occurred to me to do a little bit. And so that conversation has really changed my relationship to them as well. And I think you can take that and apply it to LSD or anything else. But I do want to note that there is a little bit of a tension in the psychedelic community between people who are proponents of microdosing and, you know, perhaps like more diehard psychonauts who are all about like take a big dose or
Right.
just don't even do it. And
Right. Yeah.
and I don't want to encourage microdosing so that we can be like, you know, more, you know, it does make you maybe more productive or calmer or less anxious or all these things, but I don't want to encourage it at the expense of discouraging super insightful, powerful experiences with any you know, any one of the number of psychedelics that are available to people.
So what is the future of psychedelics?
In the second issue of DoubleBlind, we spend a lot of time thinking about and exploring this idea of where psychedelics are headed. So much has happened in the last 6 months. The day before our first issue went to the printer, Denver decriminalized psilocybin. And as Madison mentioned, now more than 100 cities and counties are trying to decriminalize psychedelics. AOC introduced an amendment to ease up barriers to psychedelic research in the House. It didn't pass, but she did it, which is symbolically important. So 100%, we're going to see a lot of movement on the decriminalization front.
Right.
I think that 100% we're going to see the federal research on MDMA and psilocybin get approved in the next 5 years. Not only are we going to see that happen in the United States, but Compass Therapeutics, the for-profit company behind the psilocybin for depression research, is now investigating psilocybin in more than a dozen countries around the world. So we're also going to see psilocybin therapy in Europe. We see that the alternative psychedelic clinics and retreat centers are booming. So we're going to see a growth in ayahuasca retreat centers in the Amazon, ibogaine clinics in Mexico and New Zealand and elsewhere. We're going to see the rise of psilocybin clinics in Mexico and Jamaica and in the Netherlands. Synthesis is a psilocybin retreat center in the Netherlands, which is slated to have the first legal psilocybin clinic, which does the protocol very similar to the Johns Hopkins and NYU trials in the next few years. So people are going to be able to go, if they can't get into a clinical trial, to the Netherlands and have this experience with the protocol and everything in place if that's what they're looking for. So there's a ton of movement. And then, as Madison mentioned, I think what we're already seeing and we're going to see more of is sort of a psilocybin microdosing gray market emerge in the cities and counties which are decriminalizing psychedelics. A lot is happening. It's really crazy. And in the second issue of DoubleBlind, we interview this really fascinating religion scholar, cognitive scientist, brilliant guy named Justin Lane. And we asked him the same question, where psychedelics headed? And he said that if you want to look at which countries are going to legalize psychedelics, you have to look at the countries with the most money, and that oftentimes you see drug policy reform happens first in the countries, and this happened with cannabis, that have an influx of capital, because with capital comes increased liberalism, honestly. And, you know, we're going to see Western Europe, we're going to see the United States, of course, Canada, certain countries in South America already have legalized psychedelics, certain ones for religious and spiritual purposes.
Right.
But there are a lot of countries too where, like Singapore will probably never see psychedelic reform because, or Indonesia, because these places just have such strict drug laws.
I was curious about their own personal experiences with psychedelics and the value that they may have gotten from them. Madison summed it up nicely.
I mean, I'll say on my first psychedelic experience, I took magic mushrooms, and I was like, oh, be here now. I get it. And like, I had never felt so present before in my entire life as I did then. And I guess, but what people can get out of it, I mean, look, I think a lot of people could benefit from psychedelics. I don't think it's for everybody. I've been in scenarios myself, and I know a lot of my friends have also, where you can be both doing it to have an intentionally healing or insightful experience, or you can just do it for fun. And I think really that the value in psychedelics, for whatever reason you're doing it, is getting to know yourself on a different level than is normally available.
So that was my conversation with Shelby and Madison from DoubleBlind magazine. Issue number 2 is now available, and issue number 3 is coming out in June. And the online content is just at their website, doubleblindmag.com. There's new great long read online content there all the time, so check it out. The Psychedelic Suitcase is produced by Carolyn Myers and myself, your host, Dave McNee. Join us next time when we unpack more of the Psychedelic Suitcase. Until then, safe travels.